Continue the quote from the book, and we are quoting, I remind you, Daniel Webster. "I would not take pains to reaffirm an ordinance of nature," he stated, "nor to reenact the will of God." So he's saying conditions in the West aren't suitable for slavery anyways. Don't worry about it. So the Wilmot Proviso is not necessary, and he thinks that the Union should be preserved. That's his stance. Webster's speech infuriated abolitionists, but received high praise elsewhere. Even the fiery Charleston Mercury lauded his effort. "With such a spirit, it no longer seems impossible to bring this sectional contest to a close." It no longer seems impossible. So at some point it seemed impossible. By September, this is 1850, by September, Clay's proposals were enacted into law. Clay's Compromise of 1850 was hailed as the Union's salvation. Now that's 11 years before the Civil War began. That's before Lincoln ran for president. It's before he got into the presidency. And the Civil War just about damn happened. But one of its minor measures would do major damage to the chances of achieving a lasting settlement. This is the bit we looked at where it allowed the measure, quote, "was the Fugitive Slave Laws. Runaway slaves were not a serious problem for planters. Only about 1,000 escaped each year. Even so, the Fugitive Slave Law placed the full power of the federal government behind efforts to recapture runaways. Professional slave hunters, armed with affidavits from southern courts, began to scour northern cities, ferreting out runaways and sometimes kidnapping free blacks." Now, you're in the 1800s, northern city, some white guys with a federal affidavit walk up to a black guy and grab him and say, "You're a runaway." And the guy says, "No, I'm not." And they say, "You're going back to Louisiana or whichever." And he goes back down there and he has to work day in, day out. He gets whipped. If he doesn't do what he's told, he can be beaten. He's kidnapped and taken into a de facto Soviet Union. Just imagine that. A de facto Soviet Union on our southern border with petitions, legal writs from courts to come and take men out of that free country and take them back into slave territory. It's no hyperbole to call it slave territory in this case, is it? No hyperbole. So now this kidnapping of free blacks, quote, "of whom almost 200,000 lived in northern communities." 200,000 people kidnapped from northern communities. Yes, some of them were runaway slaves. So what? So what? That's like making it legal for the Soviet Union to come over here and say, "You have escaped, comrade. You will now come back and work in the cement plant like we have told you to do." The Fugitive Slave Laws galvanized the anti-slavery movement, which had been growing in strength since the 1830s. Of the 100-odd anti-slavery groups, abolitionists were the most vociferous. Not a light subject. Continuing, quote, "Blacks and whites in northern cities formed vigilance committees to protect fugitives from slave catchers. In Boston, abolitionist crowds paraded through the streets and clergymen preached civil disobedience to local slave-catching police." That's virtually a civil war, just on the base the individuals themselves got together in the communities and formed vigilante little police groups to prevent the enforcement of laws. It's gotta lead to war. You can't go on like that. You've got the most virtuous people in the world, the most virtuous nation, the most virtuous experiment in the world, and slaves in the southern part. Who can give credit to the people who attack Lincoln? Then came the case of Anthony Burns, a Virginia escapee who had been working at a Boston clothing store when Burns was arrested by a federal marshal. An abolitionist crowd was stormed the courthouse where he was being held. In the resulting melee, a special duty was killed. Regular army troops were called in, with flags flying at half-mast and church bells tolling. Burns was marched through the crepe-hung streets to the harbor and put aboard a Virginia-bound ship. Quote from a Boston attorney: "When it was all over, I put my face in my hands and wept." You're standing on a street in Boston, and a man who perhaps escaped from slavery in the South, or perhaps he's a free black, has been arrested and is being taken by consent of the government in chains to a boat, where he will be sent back to the South to live until the day he dies in a place where it's illegal for him to learn to read, and in a place where he can be legally whipped. I rest the case at that point. The tragedy outraged countless Northerners. Quote, "We went to the bed one night old-fashioned conservatives, compromise Union Whigs," wrote one, "and we waked up stark mad abolitionists." 9 states passed personal liberty statutes, which made it so difficult for slave catchers to get cooperation from Northern authorities that most gave up the chase. Hooray for liberty! So it was that the nation stood at mid-century in grave peril. The meager chances for rapprochement between the North and the South had further dimmed by 1852. At the same time, a new ingredient was added to the North-South quarrel, an ingredient that gave Americans everywhere a preview of their future. It was organized violence, and it erupted in Kansas. We've already visited that. Shortly before midnight, May 24, 1856, James Doyle, a settler well known locally for his pro-slavery sentiment, heard a knock at the door of his cabin on Potawatomi Creek in eastern Kansas. When Doyle opened the door, 5 armed men ordered him and his 2 oldest sons outside. Beneath a clear prairie sky, they killed the settler with their short, heavy swords and split his sons' skulls like melons, then departed to the wails of Doyle's wife, Mahala. Before the night was over, 2 other settlers who were known for pro-slavery views would be slain. Now that's just a group of people who get together and say, you know, John up there, he's in favor of slavery. Let's go kill him. And they go kill him. It's 5 years before the Civil War started. Who chose the Civil War? Who was responsible for the Civil War? Who was so dedicated in the Civil War that it was the bloodiest war we ever saw? Lincoln? Take now from Ulysses S. Grant an album by William S. McFeely. Do not purchase this worthless book. The whole damn thing has one quote in it that he accidentally put in there. He didn't mean to put a meaningful quote in there, but he did. Talks about how Ulysses S. Grant went around the world on a tour after the Civil War and after his terms in presidency. Quote, Bismarck, he met with Bismarck. He met, of course, with all the heads of state in every freaking town and city everywhere. Quote, Bismarck was more impressed by the restoration of the Union than the freeing of the slaves. So they're talking about this war that Grant was the general in. And Bismarck, you know, is a bloodthirsty tycoon, a very naughty character. So he was all about the freeing of the slaves being not quite as important. He was like, you kept the Union together, good job. And Grant was like, yeah, the slaves are free. So let's hear about this. Yes, said the prince, you had to save the Union, just as we had to save Germany. Grant retorts, not only to save the Union, but to destroy slavery. Comes Bismarck. I suppose, however, that the Union was the real sentiment, the dominant sentiment. In the beginning, says Grant, yeah. But as soon as slavery fired upon the flag, it was felt, we all felt, even those who did not object to slaves, that slavery must be destroyed. We felt that it was the stain to the Union that men should be bought and sold like cattle.